The crack of a whistle split the autumn air as the stagecoach rattled to a halt in front of Dawson's Saloon, throwing dust into the golden light of a fading 1875 Oklahoma sunset. Dahlia Vincent clutched her worn leather satchel against her chest, knowing that once she stepped down from this coach, her life would never be the same. At 23, with nowhere else to turn and debts mounting since her father's death, she had made the only choice available to her, selling her contract to a saloon owner 300 miles from the only home she'd ever known. "End of the line for you, miss," the driver called down, not unkindly. "Tahlequah's got a way of either making or breaking folks. Best of luck to you." Dahlia adjusted her simple blue dress, once her Sunday best, but now travel-worn and dusty after 3 days on the road. The small mining town of Tahlequah sprawled before her, busy despite the approaching evening miners trudging back from the day's work, merchants closing shops, and saloon life just beginning to stir. The air smelled of pine, dust, and somewhere distant, the promise of rain. She descended carefully, legs stiff from the journey. A tall man with a greased mustache and a velvet waistcoat that strained against his substantial belly approached with an appraising gaze that made her skin crawl. "Miss Vincent, I presume?" His breath reeked of whiskey and cigar smoke. "Edgar Dawson. Welcome to my establishment." He gestured toward the 2-story building, with peeling paint and a sign that swung in the breeze. "Your contract arrived by post last week. You'll be starting tonight." "Tonight?" Dahlia's voice caught. "But I've been traveling for—" "Your debt didn't pay itself getting here, now did it?" Dawson cut in, taking her elbow in a grip just firm enough to show he wouldn't tolerate argument. "I paid good money for your contract. 3 years of service, and not a day less." Dahlia felt her throat tighten as he led her up the wooden steps of the saloon. Inside, the smell of stale liquor and sweat assaulted her senses. A few early patrons glanced up from their cards, eyes lingering on her longer than was proper. Piano music tinked from the corner, where a gray-haired man played a tune too cheerful for the weight settling in Dahlia's chest. "Martha!" Dawson bellowed. A tired-looking woman in her 40s appeared from behind a beaded curtain. "Show our new girl to the quarters and get her ready. She starts serving tonight." "Come on, honey," Martha said, her voice gentle but her eyes reflecting a sympathy that terrified Dahlia more than Dawson's gruffness. "I'll show you where to put your things." Upstairs, Martha led her to a small room with 3 narrow beds. "You'll share with Betsy and Clara. They're good girls, been here 2 years each." She opened a trunk at the foot of one bed. "You can put your personal items here." Dahlia set down her satchel. "What exactly will I be required to do?" Martha handed her address in a shade of red that made Dahlia blush just looking at it. "You'll serve drinks, smile at the customers, and encourage them to spend money. Some girls do more, but that's between them and Dawson. Your contract's for serving only, right?" Dahlia nodded quickly. "Yes, just serving." Her father's lawyer had assured her of that much before she'd signed. "Well then," Martha's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Best get changed. The miners get generous when they're fresh paid, and tonight's payday." When Dahlia emerged downstairs an hour later, the saloon had filled with men loudly demanding drinks and attention. Her borrowed dress squeezed her waist and exposed more of her neckline than she'd shown in her entire life. Her cheeks burned as she tried to balance the tray Martha had thrust into her hands. "Whiskey to table 4, Dawson barked, sliding 3 glasses onto her tray. "And smile, girl. Nobody wants to buy drinks from a funeral director." The night passed in a blur of whistles, propositions she pretended not to hear, and hands that accidentally brushed against her as she delivered drinks. By midnight, her feet ached in the 2 small shoes Martha had lent her, and her cheeks hurt from forcing smiles. She was returning to the bar with an empty tray when the batwing doors swung open. The saloon didn't exactly quiet, but something in the atmosphere shifted. Dahlia turned to see a tall man silhouetted against the night sky. As he stepped inside, the lamplight revealed a face weathered by sun and wind, with piercing blue eyes beneath the brim of a black Stetson. His duster was coated with trail dust, and the spurs on his boots jingled softly as he approached the bar. "Flynn," Dawson greeted the newcomer with unusual deference. "Wasn't expecting you back so soon." "Job finished earlier than planned," the man called. Flynn replied, his voice deep and steady. He placed his hat on the counter, revealing dark hair with a touch of silver at the temples. He couldn't be much older than 30, Dahlia guessed, but something in his eyes spoke of experiences beyond his years. "Usual?" Dawson asked, already reaching for a bottle. "Please." As Dawson poured, the man's gaze drifted around the saloon, eventually landing on Dahlia. She quickly looked away, but not before noticing the slight narrowing of his eyes. "New girl?" Flynn asked Dawson quietly, though Dahlia was close enough to hear. "Just arrived today. Contract purchase from back east. Family debt." Flynn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see." "Dahlia!" Dawson snapped. "Don't just stand there. Table 6 needs drinks." The night wore on. Dahlia learned that the mysterious Flynn was Flynn Forrester. Apparently some kind of bounty hunter or hired gun. The whispers weren't entirely clear, and nobody seemed eager to ask him directly. He sat alone at a corner table, nursing his whiskey and watching the room with the measured gaze of a man accustomed to trouble. Near 2 in the morning, when Dahlia's legs were shaking with exhaustion, a miner with liquor-flushed cheeks grabbed her wrist as she delivered his drink. "How much for a dance, pretty lady?" he slurred, pulling her closer. "I don't dance, sir," Dahlia replied, trying to maintain her smile while extracting her wrist. "I only serve drinks." "Come on now." His grip tightened. "Everyone's got a price." The lady said no. Dahlia hadn't noticed Flynn approach, but suddenly he was there, his presence solid and commanding. The miner's face darkened. But something in Flynn's steady gaze made him reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. After a tense moment, he released Dahlia's wrist. "Just being friendly," the miner muttered. Flynn didn't respond, simply stood there until the man turned back to his companions. Only then did he look at Dahlia. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once, then returned to his table without another word. When Dahlia finally collapsed onto her assigned bed in the pre-dawn hours, the other girls already snoring softly, she pressed her face into the thin pillow and allowed herself a moment of despair. 3 years. 3 years of this life stretched before her like an endless desert. She thought of her father, of the small house they had shared in Virginia before consumption had taken him, leaving behind only memories and the gambling debts she hadn't known about until the creditors came calling. She thought of her mother, gone since Dahlia was 12, who'd taught her to play piano and to always carry herself with dignity. What dignity remained in her now, she wondered, as she drifted into an exhausted sleep, still wearing the borrowed red dress, too tired even to change. The next weeks fell into a grueling pattern. Dahlia worked from noon until the early morning hours, serving drinks, dodging wandering hands, and collapsing into bed for a few hours before starting again. She learned the rules quickly. Always smile, never refuse a drink order, and stay on Dawson's good side. Flynn Forrester appeared occasionally, sometimes staying for a single drink, other times remaining for hours at his corner table. He rarely spoke to anyone besides Dawson and the bartender, a man called Whitley who mixed drinks with the precision of a pharmacist. One evening, after Dahlia had been at the saloon nearly a month, Dawson pulled her aside. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be entertaining as well as serving." Her blood ran cold. "Entertaining?" "Playing the piano," he clarified, looking irritated at her obvious relief. "Martha says you mentioned knowing how. Our regular players got the rheumatism acting up. You'll play evenings, then serve after." The thought of playing music again lifted Dahlia's spirits marginally. At least, while she was at the piano, she wouldn't have to navigate the crowded floor and its hazards. The next evening found her seated at the out-of-tune upright piano in the corner, playing the folk songs and popular tunes she remembered from home. Her playing was rusty at first, but as her confidence returned, so did her skill. For the first time since arriving in Tahlequah, she found herself almost enjoying a moment of her new life. "You play well." Startled, Dahlia's fingers slipped on the keys. Flynn Forrester stood beside the piano, watching her with those intense blue eyes. "Thank you," she managed, continuing to play. "My mother taught me." "Where are you from?" he asked, leaning against the wall beside the piano. "Virginia, a small town you wouldn't have heard of." Something like a smile touched his lips. "Try me, I've traveled some." "Millbrook," she replied, surprised at her willingness to share even this small detail of her former life. "Near the Shenandoah," he nodded. "Pretty country." Dahlia's hands stilled on the keys. You know it? Passed through once, long time ago. He gestured toward the piano. Don't stop on my account. She resumed playing, aware of him watching her hands move across the yellowed keys. After a moment, he spoke again. Your contract. How long? The direct question took her aback. 3 years, she answered softly. His expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Before he could respond, Dawson shouted from across the room. Forrester, got a message for you. Flynn straightened, tipping his hat slightly to Dahlia. Miss Vincent, he said, then walked away, leaving her wondering how he knew her last name when she'd never introduced herself properly. The next day, Flynn was gone. Dahlia overheard Dawson telling Whitley that Forrester had taken a job tracking some cattle rustlers north of the territory. She told herself the hollow feeling in her chest was merely disappointment at losing the one patron who'd shown her basic courtesy. 6 weeks later, on a stormy night when rain lashed the saloon windows and the thunder rumbled overhead, the doors swung open to reveal Flynn Forrester, soaked to the skin and with a new scar across his left cheekbone. Evening, he said to Dawson, removing his dripping hat. Whiskey, please. Dahlia, who had been clearing a recently vacated table, found herself watching him from across the room. Something had changed in him. The steady confidence remained, but there was a new weariness in the set of his shoulders. Later, as the crowd thinned and the storm continued its assault, Dahlia approached his table to collect his empty glass. Would you like another, Mr. Forrester? He glanced up at her. Flynn, he corrected. And no, thank you. I should find a room before the entire town floods. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house has no vacancies, she offered. I overheard some travelers earlier. The storms brought everyone indoors. He sighed. Figures. Dawson, who'd been counting the night's earnings at the bar, called over. Got rooms upstairs, Forrester, if you're stuck. $2. Flynn hesitated, then nodded. Appreciated. Dawson tossed a key to Dahlia. Show him to room 3. She led Flynn up the narrow staircase to the second floor, past the girls' shared room to a corridor with 4 doors. It's not much, she warned, unlocking the third door. But it's dry. The room was small with a narrow bed, washstand, and chair. Flynn surveyed it with a neutral expression. It'll do. Dahlia handed him the key, their fingers brushing briefly. Good night, Mr. Flynn. He caught her wrist gently as she turned to leave. Dahlia? Her name sounded different in his voice. Are you all right? The unexpected question nearly undid her. For weeks she'd maintained her composure, smiling mechanically and enduring, but the simple query and the genuine concern behind it threatened to crack her carefully constructed facade. I'm managing, she answered, her voice barely steady. He released her wrist. If you ever need help, I don't. She cut him off more sharply than intended. But thank you. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. Fair enough. Good night. Then, she closed the door behind her and leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. Flynn Forrester was dangerous, not because she feared he might harm her, but because his kindness made her feel things she couldn't afford to feel. Hope was a luxury beyond her means. Flynn stayed 3 days while the storm persisted and the roads turned to mud. During that time, he kept largely to himself, disappearing during daylight hours and returning to occupy his usual corner table in the evenings. Occasionally, Dahlia would catch him watching her, his expression unreadable. On the afternoon of the 4th day, as Dahlia helped Martha clean the main room before opening, the door opened to admit a harried-looking man in an ill-fitting suit. I'm looking for Edgar Dawson, he announced, brushing water from his sleeves. Though the rain had stopped, the streets remained flooded in places. Who's asking? Dawson emerged from his office behind the bar. Herbert Wells, attorney at law. The man produced a card. I represent a client who wishes to discuss business with you. Dawson's eyebrows rose. What kind of business? A private matter, Wells replied, glancing pointedly at Dahlia and Martha. Ladies, finish up in the back, Dawson ordered. As Dahlia passed through the beaded curtain to the storeroom, she heard Wells say, My client wishes to purchase a contract. Later that evening, as the saloon filled with its usual crowd, Dahlia noticed Flynn in conversation with Dawson at the bar. Their discussion appeared intense, with Dawson shaking his head repeatedly and Flynn leaning in to speak in low tones. Finally, Dawson threw up his hands in apparent exasperation and stomped to his office, Flynn following. When they emerged 20 minutes later, Dawson looked disgruntled but resigned. Flynn's expression gave nothing away. He tipped his hat to Dawson, then left without a glance in Dahlia's direction. The next morning, Dahlia was summoned to Dawson's office. She entered nervously, wondering if she'd somehow displeased him. "Miss Vincent," he began, shuffling papers on his cluttered desk. "It seems your services here are no longer required." Her heart stuttered. "Sir, your contract has been purchased by another party." He pushed a document toward her. "As of noon today, you are released from your obligation to this establishment." Dahlia stared at the paper, uncomprehending. "I don't understand." "Who? Flynn Forrester?" Dawson looked distinctly unhappy. "Paid 3 times what I paid for you. Bad business sense, if you ask me, but his money's good." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "He purchased me?" "Your contract," Dawson corrected irritably. "Man was very specific about the wording. Said to tell you he'll meet you at the general store at noon to discuss terms." Dahlia left the office in a daze. Martha found her in their shared room, staring at the wall. "Heard the news," the older woman said gently. "Flynn's a good man, honey, better than most who pass through here." "I hardly know him," Dahlia whispered. Martha sat beside her on the bed. "Sometimes that's better. Clean slate." She patted Dahlia's hand. "Look at it this way. Whatever he wants from you. It can't be worse than 3 years here." Dahlia wasn't so certain. Flynn Forrester had shown her kindness, yes, but men's kindnesses often came with expectations. Still, at noon, she found herself standing outside Harper's General Store, her few possessions packed in her satchel, waiting. Flynn arrived precisely at 12, riding a magnificent chestnut gelding and leading a dappled mare. He dismounted in one fluid motion, tying both horses to the hitching post. "Miss Vincent," he greeted her, removing his hat. In the bright sunlight, his eyes were the color of a summer sky. "Mr. Forrester," she replied stiffly, "I understand I have you to thank for my change in circumstances." Something like amusement crossed his features. "You don't sound particularly thankful." "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel," she admitted. "I've been sold from one man to another." His expression sobered. "Not quite." He reached into his coat and produced the contract. "This is yours. Do with it what you will." Hesitantly, she took the document. "I don't understand." "It's simple," he said. "You're free. Your debt is paid. What you do next is entirely your choice." Dahlia stared at him. "Why would you do this?" Flynn glanced down the street, then back to her. "Because no person should be owned by another. Not for any reason." There was a quiet intensity to his words that suggested personal experience. "I can't possibly repay you," she said, clutching the contract. "I'm not asking you to." He gestured toward the store. "I've arranged credit for you here, enough to get wherever you want to go. Or to stay if that's your preference." Dahlia felt overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. Freedom after resigning herself to years of servitude. It seemed too good to be true. "There must be something you want in return," she pressed. Flynn studied her for a long moment. "There is one thing," he finally said. "Have dinner with me tonight. Just conversation. After that, you never have to see me again, if that's your wish." It was such a simple request that Dahlia found herself nodding before she'd fully considered it. "All right, dinner." "Good." He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his features. "The hotel dining room at 6? It's not fancy, but the food's decent." 6, she agreed. Flynn tipped his hat. "Until then." He untied the chestnut and mounted in one smooth motion. The dappled mare remained tethered to the post. "The mare?" Dahlia asked, confused. "Also yours," he said. "Hard to get around these parts without a horse." With that, he turned his mount and rode off, leaving Dahlia staring after him in disbelief. Inside Harper's General Store, she discovered that credit was an understatement. Flynn had arranged for her to select an entirely new wardrobe, toiletries, and basic necessities. When she protested to Mrs. Harper, the shopkeeper's wife, that it was too much, the woman smiled knowingly. Mr. Forrester said you'd say that. He also said to remind you that freedom means making your own choices, including accepting help when it's offered. By 6 o'clock, Dahlia had moved her belongings to a room at the Tahlequah Hotel, stabled her new mare, whom she'd decided to call Liberty, and changed into a modest blue dress that matched her eyes, purchased from Harper's that afternoon. She'd also used part of her unexpected credit to buy a small silver hairpin, the only extravagance she'd allowed herself. Flynn was waiting in the hotel dining room, freshly shaved and wearing a clean white shirt under a dark vest. He rose when she entered, pulling out her chair with a courtesy that seemed natural rather than performed. "You look lovely," he said simply as she sat. "Thank you?" She smoothed her napkin across her lap, suddenly nervous. "For everything. I still don't understand why you've done all this." Flynn signaled the waiter before answering. After they had ordered, he leaned back slightly in his chair, regarding her with those discerning eyes. 3 years ago, he began, I was tracking a man wanted for murder across the Nebraska Territory. Trail led me to a mining town not unlike this one. While there, I witnessed a saloon owner publicly whipping a young woman who'd tried to run from her contract. His jaw tightened at the memory. Nobody intervened. It was business, they said. Dahlia felt a chill despite the warm dining room. What happened to her? She died 2 days later. Infection. Flynn's gaze was steady. I found the man I was tracking, brought him in, collected my bounty. Then I returned to that town and bought every contract that saloon owner held. 6 women. Cost me nearly everything I had. What did you do with them? Dahlia asked softly. Set them free. Gave each enough money to start somewhere new. A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. One's running a millinery shop in Kansas now. Another married a farmer in Colorado. One went home to her family in Missouri. And the others? Don't know. That was their choice too. He paused as the waiter brought their meals. Since then, when I can, I do the same. It's not much against the larger problem, but it means everything to those women, Dahlia finished for him. To me. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the tension that had been present when she arrived gradually dissolving. What will you do now? Flynn eventually asked. Dahlia considered the question. I'm not sure. I could return to Virginia, I suppose, though there's nothing for me there anymore. You could stay in Tahlequah, he suggested. Town's growing. They're building a proper schoolhouse. Woman who plays piano might find work teaching music. The idea hadn't occurred to her. Perhaps, she mused. What about you? Where do you go next? Montana, eventually. Got some land there, cabin by a lake. But I've got business in Kansas first. Probably be gone a month or 2. Is that what you do? Buy land everywhere you go? She meant it lightly, but his expression turned thoughtful. No, Montana's different. He seemed to search for the right words. It's where I go when I need to remember who I am, outside of what I do. Something about his description resonated with her. How long had it been since she'd thought of herself as more than a daughter paying her father's debts, more than a contract to be traded? It sounds peaceful, she said. It is. His eyes met hers. Lonely sometimes, but peaceful. The vulnerability in that admission touched something in Dahlia. Flynn Forrester, for all his capability and confidence, was a solitary man. Perhaps that explained his compassion for others in similar isolation. After dinner, he walked her to her hotel room door. Thank you for joining me, he said, standing a respectful distance away. Thank you for dinner, and for my freedom. Dahlia hesitated, then added, Will I see you before you leave for Kansas? If you'd like. There was no presumption in his tone, only a question. I would, she said softly. Flynn nodded, a slight smile warming his features. Tomorrow, then. Perhaps I could show you around Tahlequah properly, places beyond the saloon. I'd like that, he tipped his hat. Good night, Dahlia. Good night, Flynn. Inside her room, Dahlia sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the silver hairpin. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope. The next day dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for exploring Tahlequah. Flynn met Dahlia at the hotel with Liberty and his own mount, a plan to ride to a nearby bluff that offered views of the entire valley. As they rode through town, Dahlia saw Tahlequah through new eyes. Without the shadow of her contract hanging over her, the bustling streets seemed full of possibility rather than threat. Flynn pointed out landmarks, the new bank being constructed on the corner, the church with its freshly painted steeple, the offices of the territorial newspaper. "Town's changing," he observed as they passed the staked outlines of what would become the railroad station. 5 years ago, this was barely more than an outpost. Now there's talk of it becoming a proper city. "Have you been coming here long?" Dahlia asked, growing comfortable on Liberty's smooth gait. "Off and on for about 8 years. It's on the route between Kansas and Texas." He glanced at her. "You sit a horse well." "My father taught me," she replied. "We had a farm before things changed." Flynn didn't press for details, a courtesy she appreciated. Instead, he led her out of town, along a trail that wound through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. When they reached the bluff, Dahlia gasped at the view. The valley spread before them in a patchwork of greens and golds, the town a collection of toy-sized buildings near a silver ribbon of river. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Flynn helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Worth the ride?" "Absolutely." She moved to the edge of the bluff, drinking in the panorama. "I never saw landscapes like this in Virginia." "The West has its own kind of beauty," Flynn agreed, standing beside her. "Harsher than the East, maybe, but honest in its way." They settled on a flat rock, sharing the lunch Mrs. Harper had packed for them: bread, cheese, apples, and cold chicken. Flynn told stories of his travels, from the sweeping plains of Nebraska to the red rock canyons of Arizona Territory. Dahlia found herself captivated not just by the tales, but by the man telling them the subtle humor in his observations, the respect with which he spoke of the different peoples he'd encountered, the quiet competence that underlay everything he did. "How did you become a bounty hunter?" she asked, as they packed up the remains of their lunch. Flynn's expression turned reflective. "War ended. I needed work. Was good with a gun and tracking. Seemed a natural fit." He shrugged slightly. "It's not what I'll do forever." "What will you do instead?" "Ranch in Montana. Got about 50 head of cattle already. Neighbor looks after them when I'm away." His eyes scanned the horizon. "Few more years of this work, I'll have enough saved to build it proper. Maybe find someone willing to share that life." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but present. Dahlia found herself imagining such a life mountains instead of these rolling hills, a cabin beside a lake, quiet evenings after honest day's work. "It sounds lovely," she said finally. Flynn's gaze returned to her, something warm in his eyes. "It could be." The ride back to town was comfortable, filled with easy conversation. Dahlia told him about her childhood in Virginia, her mother's love of music, her father's struggles after her mother's death. Flynn listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. As they approached Tahlequah, the setting sun painting the buildings in gold and shadow, Flynn said, "I leave for Kansas tomorrow morning." Though she'd known his departure was imminent, Dahlia felt a sharp pang of disappointment. "So soon?" "Got a telegram while you were at Harper's yesterday. Man, I'm tracking was spotted in Dodge." He glanced at her. "I'll be back, though. Month or so." "I might not be here," she said, testing the words. "I could go anywhere now." Flynn nodded, no hint of challenge in his expression. "That's true. Freedom means choosing your own path." They returned the horses to the livery stable and walked to the hotel in the gathering dusk. Outside her door, Flynn removed his hat, holding it before him. "Whatever you decide, Dahlia, I wish you happiness." The formality of his farewell suggested he truly expected this might be goodbye. Dahlia realized with sudden clarity that she didn't want it to be. "Flynn," she began, then hesitated. Would you write to me while you're gone? If I stay in Tahlequah?" His expression lightened. "I'd like that. And perhaps when you return, if I'm still here, we could continue our conversations." "I'd like that even more." He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Good night, Dahlia." Good night, Flynn. After he'd gone, Dahlia sat at the small writing desk in her room and penned a letter to Mrs. Harper, inquiring whether the shopkeeper's wife knew of anyone in town who might need music lessons, taking control of her future, one small decision at a time. True to his word, Flynn wrote. His letters arrived irregularly, sometimes 2 in a week, sometimes with gaps of 10 days or more, but each one gave Dahlia a window into his world. He described the endless Kansas horizon, the dusty streets of Dodge City, the characters he encountered in his work. His handwriting was neat, but clearly that of a man who would learn penmanship later in life, with occasional creative spellings that made her smile. Dahlia found herself treasuring these glimpses into his thoughts. Between the lines of his straightforward accounts, she detected a thoughtfulness, a quiet humor, and an increasing willingness to share his reflections rather than just the facts of his days. Meanwhile, she built her own life in Tahlequah. Through Mrs. Harper's connections, she secured 3 piano students, children of the town's more prosperous families. The new schoolmaster, learning of her musical ability, hired her to teach singing twice weekly. It wasn't much, but combined with careful management of the funds Flynn had provided, it allowed her to maintain her room at the hotel and begin saving a little. She made friends. 2, Martha from the Saloon occasionally joined her for Sunday services at the small church, and Mrs. Harper invited her to weekly sewing circles where the townswomen exchanged news and gossip. Slowly, Tahlequah began to feel less like a place of exile and more like a community. 6 weeks after Flynn's departure, Dahlia returned to her hotel room after a lesson to find a telegram waiting. Arriving Thursday. Stop. Hope you are still in Tahlequah. Stop, Flynn. Her heart quickened as she read the brief message. Thursday, just 2 days away. She glanced at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened, exhausted girl who'd arrived at Dawson's Saloon months earlier. Her cheeks had filled out from regular meals, her eyes had regained their sparkle, and she carried herself with a confidence born of independence. When Thursday arrived, Dahlia found herself changing her dress 3 times before settling on a green calico that Mrs. Harper insisted brought out the auburn highlights in her dark hair. She was arranging flowers in her room, purchased that morning from the widow Jones, who sold blooms from her garden, when a knock sounded at her door. Flynn stood in the hallway, hat in hand, his tall frame filling the doorway. He looked tired but vital, with a new tan from weeks in the Kansas sun, and a healing cut above his right eyebrow. "You're still here?" he said, a smile spreading across his features. "I am," she confirmed, suddenly shy despite weeks of correspondence. "Would you like to come in, or we could walk?" "It's a lovely afternoon. A walk would be nice after days in the saddle." They strolled through Tahlequah's streets, Dahlia pointing out changes since his departure. The completed roof on the new bank, the freshly painted sign outside the dressmaker's shop, the arrival of a photographer who'd set up a studio on Main Street. "The town suits you," Flynn observed as they paused near the small park where children played under the watchful eyes of some mothers and nursemaids. "I've found a place here," she agreed. "Small but mine." He smiled. "Not so small. Mrs. Harper writes that half the town's children are clamoring for Miss Vincent's piano lessons." "You correspond with Mrs. Harper?" Dahlia asked, surprised. Flynn's cheeks colored slightly. "Had to make sure you were truly all right." The admission touched her. "I am. Better than all right." She hesitated, then added, "Your letters helped. They gave me something to look forward to." "I'm not much of a writer," he said, rubbing the back of his neck in a gesture she was coming to recognize as uncertainty. "You're better than you think," she assured him. "I felt like I was there with you sometimes, seeing what you saw." They continued walking, ending up at the small restaurant where they'd first dined together. Over a meal of roast beef and potatoes, Flynn shared details of his Kansas journey that hadn't made it into his letters, the successful capture of the man he'd been tracking, a brief reunion with one of the women he'd freed, who'd opened that millinery shop he'd mentioned, an encounter with a traveling medicine show that had him chuckling as he described the outlandish claims of the snake oil salesman. "How long will you stay in Tahlequah?" Dahlia asked as they lingered over coffee. "A week, maybe 2, he replied. Need to rest, resupply. Then I've got business in Fort Smith. And after that, Flynn's eyes met hers. Montana for a while, winter's coming. Need to check on the ranch, help with preparations. He hesitated. It's beautiful there in the snow, everything quiet and white for miles. Dahlia could hear the longing in his voice. You miss it. More each time I leave, he admitted. Started building a proper house this spring to replace the cabin. Nothing fancy but solid. 4 rooms downstairs, 2 up in the loft. Sounds like more than you'd need living alone, she observed, her heart beating faster. Flynn's gaze was steady. A man can hope he won't always be alone. The week that followed was the happiest of Dahlia's life. Flynn accompanied her on walks, sat in on her music lessons, enduring the giggles of her young students at the sight of the formidable bounty hunter perched on a piano bench, and escorted her to Sunday services, where half the congregation watched them with undisguised interest. In the evenings, they talked for hours about books they'd read, places they'd seen or hoped to see, dreams they harbored for the future. Flynn revealed more of himself, how he'd lost his parents to fever as a teenager, his service in the Union Army during the war, his brief attempt at conventional employment afterward before finding his current path. The war changed me, he confessed one evening as they sat on the hotel's small veranda watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Saw too much death, too young, came back not knowing how to live in peaceful times. And now? Dahlia asked softly. His hand found hers in the gathering darkness. Now, I'm remembering. On his final evening in Tahlequah, Flynn invited Dahlia to dinner at the hotel restaurant. When she arrived, she found the corner table decorated with wildflowers and candles, a bottle of wine already opened. What's the occasion? She asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. Flynn helped her into her chair. Needed to ask you something important. Wanted to do it proper. Dahlia's pulse quickened. They hadn't spoken directly of feelings, though the growing attachment between them had become increasingly evident in small touches, lingering glances, and the ease with which they occupied each other's space. They made it through the main course with conversation about safe topics, the unseasonably warm weather, Mrs. Harper's new shipment of fabrics from St. Louis, Flynn's plans for the journey to Fort Smith. Only when dessert arrived, apple pie with fresh cream, did he finally reach into his pocket and withdraw a small velvet pouch. Dahlia, he began, his normally steady voice betraying a hint of nervousness. These past months, getting to know you through letters and these weeks together, they've been the happiest of my life. She set down her fork, her appetite forgotten as he continued. I know it hasn't been long, not by conventional standards. And I'd understand if you need more time. But I'm not a conventional man, and life out here doesn't always allow for lengthy courtships. He placed the pouch on the table between them. I'm asking if you'd consider becoming my wife. With trembling fingers, Dahlia opened the pouch. Inside lay a simple gold band with a small pearl set in its center. It was my mother's, Flynn explained. Only thing I have left of hers. Tears pricked Dahlia's eyes. Flynn, before you answer, he said quickly, you should know what I'm offering. Life in Montana wouldn't be easy. It's beautiful but harsh, remote. The nearest town is a half-day's ride. Winters are long and brutal, and I'd still need to travel for work, at least for a few more years. You're trying to talk me out of accepting, she observed with a watery smile. He shook his head, reaching across the table to take her hand. I'm making sure you understand what you'd be agreeing to. I don't want you to have regrets. Dahlia looked at the ring, then at the man before her, this complicated, honorable man who'd given her freedom and then, miraculously, her heart's desire. Ask me properly, she whispered. Flynn's eyes widened slightly, then crinkled at the corners as he understood her meaning. In one smooth motion, he moved from his chair to kneel beside her. Dahlia Vincent, will you marry me? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you, Flynn Forrester. His smile illuminated his entire face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if meant for her all along. When? He asked, returning to his seat, but keeping her hand in his. As soon as possible, she replied with certainty. I don't need a fancy wedding or long engagement, just you. They were married 3 days later in Tahlequah's small church, with Martha, the Harpers, and a handful of Dahlia's students and their parents as witnesses. Dahlia wore a new dress of cream-colored silk, purchased from Harper's store, with wildflowers in her hair. Flynn looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new black suit, though his discomfort vanished when Dahlia appeared at the church door. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Flynn bent to kiss her with a tenderness that belied his strength, Dahlia knew with absolute certainty that she'd found her true home not in Virginia or Tahlequah or even Montana, but with this man who'd rescued her in more ways than he'd ever intended. They spent their wedding night at the hotel in a suite Mr. Jenkins had insisted on providing as his gift. In the privacy of that room, Flynn's characteristic confidence gave way to a gentleness that moved Dahlia deeply. He treated her body as something precious, his touch as reverent as he guided her through the unfamiliar territory of physical love. Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight spilled through the window, Dahlia traced the scars that mapped his chest and shoulders, souvenirs of his dangerous profession. "Will you really give it up someday?" she asked. "The bounty hunting?" Flynn's hand stroked her hair. "Yes, 2 years, 3 at most. Already taking fewer jobs, more selectively." He kissed her forehead. "Want to be a rancher, a husband, maybe someday a father." The thought of their children filled Dahlia with a warm glow. "I'd like that. We'll build a good life," he promised. "It won't always be easy, but it'll be ours." They left for Montana 2 days later, traveling by stagecoach and train through Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming territory. The journey was long and sometimes arduous, but Dahlia found herself enjoying the adventure of it, seeing new landscapes, meeting fellow travelers, and most of all, experiencing it all beside Flynn. By late November, they reached Billings, the last major town before their final destination. There, Flynn purchased a sturdy wagon and supplies for the remaining journey: flour, coffee, sugar, salt, ammunition, tools, and winter clothing for Dahlia, who'd never experienced a Montana winter. "How much farther?" she asked as they loaded the wagon on a crisp morning, their breath-forming clouds in the cold air. 2 days, good weather," Flynn replied, securing a crate of canned goods. "There's a road of sorts most of the way, but the last few miles are just trail." They departed at dawn, Flynn driving the team of heavy draft horses with Dahlia beside him on the wagon seat, wrapped in buffalo robes against the deepening chill. Liberty and Flynn's chestnut star followed tied to the back of the wagon. The landscape changed as they traveled northwest, the rolling plains giving way to increasingly dramatic terrain. By late afternoon of the second day, mountains rose before them, their peaks already white with early snow. "Almost home," Flynn said, as the wagon rumbled across a wooden bridge spanning a fast-flowing creek. "Our land starts about a mile ahead, runs all the way to that ridge." He pointed toward a distant tree-covered slope. Dahlia felt a flutter of nervous excitement. After weeks of travel and months of anticipation, she was about to see the place Flynn had described so vividly in his letters, the place that would be their home. They crested a small rise, and suddenly there it was. A valley cradled between forested hills, with a lake gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Near the lake's edge stood a house, not the cabin Flynn had described in his early letters, but a proper 2-story structure of squared logs with a wide porch and stone chimney, smoke curling invitingly from its stack. "Flynn," Dahlia breathed, "you said you'd started building, but this—" "Had help," he explained, a note of pride in his voice. "Neighbors pitched in when I was away. Telegram from Kansas let them know I was bringing home a wife." He glanced at her. "Do you like it?" "It's beautiful," she said honestly, taking in the setting, the house nestled among tall pines, the mountains rising majestically in the background, the peaceful lake reflecting the sky's deepening blue. As they approached, a figure emerged from the house, a stocky man in his 50s, with a salt and pepper beard and flannel shirt. "About time you got here, Forrester," he called, striding toward the wagon. "Was beginning to think you'd change your mind about coming back." "Would take more than Kansas to keep me away, Peterson," Flynn replied with a grin, pulling the wagon to a halt. He jumped down and helped Dahlia descend, keeping an arm around her waist as he turned to the older man. "Dahlia, this is James Peterson, our nearest neighbor, and the best builder in 3 territories. James, my wife, Dahlia. Madam, Peterson greeted her, removing his hat. Pleasure to meet you at last. Flynn's letters were full of you. Thank you for your work on our home, Dahlia said warmly. It's more beautiful than I imagined. Wait till you see inside, Peterson replied with a wink. The ladies from the valley came by yesterday. Got everything ready for the new mistress of Fox Creek Ranch. Flynn raised an eyebrow. Fox Creek Ranch? Need a proper name for a proper spread, Peterson shrugged. Your wife can change it if she doesn't care for it. I think it's perfect, Dahlia said, glancing up at Flynn. He smiled down at her. Then Fox Creek Ranch it is. Peterson helped them unload the wagon, then departed with promises to return in a few days with his wife for a proper welcome. Left alone as twilight descended, Flynn swept Dahlia into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their new home. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. A large main room with stone fireplace, solid wooden furniture, and colorful woven rugs. A kitchen with a cast-iron stove and pine cupboards stocked with dishes and provisions. A small study lined with bookshelves. And upstairs, 2 bedrooms, the larger featuring a massive 4-poster bed covered with a handmade quilt. The women of the valley, Flynn explained, seeing her surprise at the homey touches curtains at the windows, framed needlework on the walls, vases of dried flowers on the tables. They've been waiting years for one of their own to join them. That night, they dined on a stew Peterson's wife had left, warming on the stove, with fresh bread and preserved peaches. After, they sat before the fire, Dahlia nestled against Flynn's side, both content in the knowledge that, after all their separate journeys, they'd found their way home together. Winter came early that year, blanketing Fox Creek Ranch in deep snow by mid-December. Dahlia, who'd never experienced such isolation or cold, adapted with a resilience that made Flynn proud. She learned to manage the large stove, to preserve meat in the cold cellar, to gauge the weather from subtle signs in the sky and wind. Flynn taught her to shoot, a necessary skill for a woman who might be alone while her husband tended cattle in distant pastures. She proved a quick study, her natural steadiness, an asset with the rifle. By January, she could hit targets at distances that impressed even Peterson when he visited. The neighboring families, scattered though they were, with the closest 3 miles away, welcomed Dahlia warmly. The women especially, hungry for female companionship in this male-dominated frontier, made regular visits despite difficult travel conditions. They brought gifts of preserves and handicrafts, shared recipes and frontier wisdom, and, most valuably, friendship. In return, Dahlia offered music. Flynn had arranged for a piano to be delivered just before the heavy snows, a surprise wedding gift that had left her speechless with joy. On Sunday afternoons, weather permitting, neighbors gathered at Fox Creek Ranch for impromptu concerts and sing-alongs, the house filled with laughter and melody. Flynn watched his wife bloom in their shared life with a sense of wonder. She, who had endured so much hardship, approached their rugged existence with cheerful determination, finding beauty in the snow-laden pines, adventure in learning to use snowshoes, and contentment in their evenings of reading aloud by the fire. Their happiness deepened in February when Dahlia discovered she was expecting a child. Flynn's reaction to the news stunned joy, followed by tender solicitude confirmed what she already knew. He would be as devoted a father as he was a husband. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it arrived, it transformed their valley with explosive greenery and wildflowers carpeting the meadows. As the snow receded, Flynn took Dahlia on horseback tours of their property, showing her the high pastures where the cattle would graze in summer, the streams teeming with trout, the berry patches that would yield fruit for preserving. Their child arrived in early November, a son with Flynn's blue eyes and Dahlia's dark hair, whom they named William after her father. Flynn, who had faced armed outlaws without flinching, found himself terrified by the tiny bundle in his arms, overwhelmed by love and responsibility in equal measure. "He's perfect," he whispered to Dahlia as their son slept between them on their 3rd night as parents. "You're perfect." She smiled tiredly, still recovering from the difficult birth. "We're perfect together, all 3 of us." The years that followed brought changes and growth to Fox Creek Ranch. Flynn kept his promise, gradually taking fewer bounty hunting jobs until, by William's 3rd birthday, He had retired from that life completely. The ranch prospered under his full attention, the herd grew, outbuildings expanded, and their reputation for quality stock spread throughout the territory. Dahlia, meanwhile, found unexpected fulfillment not just as wife and mother, but as a teacher. As more families settled in the valley, she began offering music lessons from their home. By the time their daughter Elizabeth was born, a spirited girl who arrived in the midst of a summer thunderstorm, 5 years after William Dahlia had 6 regular students and a small choir that performed at community gatherings. The house expanded to a larger kitchen, a dedicated music room, a covered walkway connecting to a new barn. Each addition represented not just physical growth, but the deepening roots of their life together. They faced hardships, of course harsh winters that threatened the herd, a fire that destroyed an outbuilding, illnesses that left them frightened for their children. But they weathered each crisis together, their partnership strengthening with each challenge overcome. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, with the children asleep upstairs and a November snow falling gently outside, Flynn and Dahlia sat before the fire in the main room, a bottle of wine between them. 10 years, Flynn mused, refilling their glasses. At 43, his hair showed more silver than brown now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but he remained as vigorous and capable as when Dahlia had first met him. Sometimes it seems like yesterday we met. Other times, I can barely remember life before you. Dahlia, still beautiful at 33, though childbearing and frontier life had softened her figure, leaned against his shoulder. Do you ever regret it? Giving up your other life for this? Flynn's arm tightened around her. Not for a single moment. He gazed around the room, at the comfortable furnishings, the children's toys neatly stored in a corner, the piano where Dahlia still played every evening. This you, William, Elizabeth, our home, this is everything I never dared hope for. Even when I burned the biscuits, she teased, or when William turned the piglets loose in the garden. Even then. He chuckled, then grew serious. Especially then, those imperfect moments. They're what make it real. Dahlia set down her wine and took her husband's face between her hands. A decade of love had taught her to read the emotions behind his measured expressions, the tenderness in his eyes now, the contentment in the set of his mouth. I never thanked you properly, she said softly, for buying my contract that day, for giving me my freedom. Flynn shook his head slightly. No need for thanks. I did what was right. And then you gave me so much more, she continued. A home, a family, a life beyond anything I could have imagined when I stepped off that stagecoach in Tahlequah. You gave me just as much, he countered, turning to kiss her palm. More, maybe. Purpose, peace. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white. Inside, Fox Creek Ranch, Flynn and Dahlia Forrester sat before the fire, their past hardships transformed by time and love into the foundation of a shared life neither could have foreseen on that fateful day when a desperate young woman arrived at a frontier saloon and a principled man decided to intervene. To the next 10 years, Flynn proposed, raising his glass. And the 10 after that, Dahlia added, touching her glass to his, and all the years beyond. As they sealed their toast with a kiss, both knew with certainty that the contract signed between them, not the paper one that had brought them together, but the unwritten one of love, respect, and partnership, was the most valuable possession either would ever claim. In the bedroom above, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge, even if they couldn't articulate it, that they were growing up in a home built on a foundation of genuine love. Outside, Fox Creek Ranch stood strong against the elements, a testament to what could be created when two people chose each other freely and built a life with purpose. For Flynn and Dahlia Forrester, what had begun as an act of principle had blossomed into something neither could have predicted, a love story written not in grand gestures but in daily choices, shared burdens, and the quiet joy of building something lasting together on the American frontier.